Zelensky, Poroshenko, and Kuchma. These friends found their place in Epstein's files. And this, well, could have been a sensation if not for, well, what not for? So let's figure out in what context these names are even mentioned. In the files of this person whom you've all heard of, whom the whole world has already heard about. In the so-called Epstein files, Ukrainian politicians are mentioned dozens of times, but there they appear exclusively as subjects of political discussions or in news digests. In the files, the current President Zelensky is mentioned at least 24 times. Mostly, these are news headlines and mentions in articles that were sent to FBI employees by email. This is reported by Dzerkalo. The name of the fifth president, Petro Poroshenko, is mentioned 25 times, one time more. Most often, these are also mentions in news and publications. Kuchma is mentioned in the documents 3 times. In particular, it refers to the murder of journalist Gongadze and the cassette scandal in the autobiography of American lawyer Alan Dershowitz, who was advising Kuchma at the time. There is also one mention each of Tymoshenko, Yanukovych, Yushchenko, Derkach, and Vitaly Klitschko. By the way, there's something very interesting about Derkach. Not only is Derkach mentioned there, but also the city of Sumy. It is also mentioned. And memes have already appeared across our Ukrainian internet saying that Ternopil is definitely not in Epstein's files. Everyone, calm down. Well, that's just for humor. But when it comes to Derkach, the story here is actually quite interesting. In the Epstein case documents, the city of Sumy and former deputy Derkach are mentioned. The politician appears in the context of spreading information about US corruption, including the case involving Joe Biden, and is identified as a Russian agent. That's how it is. The US Department of Justice continues to release these documents. And in particular, they write that in the new batch of documents released by the Department of Justice, the city of Sumy is mentioned about 10 times. In 10 files, specifically in several messages where trips by the individual, meaning Derkach from Kyiv to Sumy, are mentioned. An address in the regional center is also mentioned there. According to the data, a person born in 1990 is registered here and an emergency contact phone number is provided. It is also mentioned in approximately 14 files. Andrii Derkach himself is a former Ukrainian member of parliament who is now a member of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation, and he is a traitor to Ukraine. Mentions of him include quotes from American media, in particular Politico, The Federalist, and the New York Times. Mostly, he is mentioned in the context of interfering in US political processes and spreading information about corruption. The Washington Post article is mentioned, and so on. In one of the excerpts, it is said that Derkach allegedly passed information to certain individuals. To American lawmakers, however, there is no direct evidence that he actually did this. So, such explicit references and mentions do exist, by the way, regarding potential coups and other similar political upheavals. And similar things, what we are observing actually taking place now, is that we are seeing an unprecedented and incredibly massive wave of activity. This is simply called an information attack. Look, even Ukrinform is paying attention to this. They note that Russian propaganda has spread more than 300 fake publications. These include mentions of Ukraine in the Epstein files. I have just given you specific facts where these mentions really did occur, who is mentioned there, and in what context. For example, Derkach, who may possibly be a Russian agent. Next, the Russian Federation. They picked all this up and are publishing it by the hundreds. Materials which supposedly relate to all these alleged conspiracies in Ukraine, in particular using the so-called Epsteins, where the Ukrainian state and its leadership are being discredited. A few more details about this. According to the publication Spravdi, on about 145 online resources that systematically spread disinformation and manipulative information. Almost 20,000 materials mentioning Ukraine were recorded. This is almost 2,000 times more than the number of publications in over 1,000 legitimate foreign media outlets, where about 10,000 materials were published during the same period. Thus, about 66% of foreign language content about Ukraine was posted on resources involved in foreign information manipulations and interventions coordinated with the Russian Federation, and they draw conclusions. The monitoring is real. According to the actual monitoring data, one of the key tools of the information attack was manipulation surrounding the published Epstein files. In this area, 300 publications were recorded in which any mention of the country, Ukrainian politicians, or cities was used to promote narratives about an alleged coup d'etat, external governance, and total corruption. At the same time, there was coordinated dissemination of materials aimed at discrediting Ukraine's diplomatic efforts and President Zelensky personally, who was accused of being incapable of making agreements, violating the so-called energy truce, and attempting to disrupt the negotiation process. These messages were spread on the eve of the next round of consultations in Abu Dhabi. In addition, Russian propaganda actively exploited the topic of the energy crisis in Ukraine. The key news trigger was the blackout on January 31st, around which about 500 manipulative. These publications used such materials to reinforce the image of Ukraine as a so-called failed state. In other words, as a fake state, as well as to shift responsibility for Russian strikes on the energy infrastructure onto the Ukrainian authorities and regarding the pretext. So what was the pretext? You know, whenever a narrative is constructed, especially a propagandist one, there always has to be a specific proven fact, at least some small detail on which this whole big structure can be built. In this case, when we're talking about 300 fake publications referencing the Epstein files, that's the small detail. It looks like this. Friends, this is a screenshot from a real email correspondence from a mailbox, Epstein's. You see, here it says, to Rothschild from Jeffrey Epstein. That's exactly what it says. Tuesday, what date is it? Let's see, it's March 18th, 2014, 3:40 p.m. Yes, 3:40 in the afternoon. And here, in this excerpt, Jeffrey Epstein mentions, friends, he mentions what? He mentions that the coup in Ukraine will provide, quote, many opportunities. The letter was sent to a representative of the French branch of the family, Andrii de Rothschild, who, since March 2023, has headed one of the family's French banks. But the letter was sent on the 14th. You know that by the 19th, it was already gone, right? So here he writes again that the coup in Ukraine will bring a lot. And here it starts. Aha, fail, state, coup, government, Derkach, traitors back and forth, this and that. But all of this is not the most interesting part of this story. The thing is, this could be connected to another round. During the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, there were attempts to adjust them, maybe somehow influence the leadership of Ukraine. Look, what we know is that you all are writing about how Epstein was a Russian intelligence agent. And then we have a bunch of compromising material on all of you. And this is a very serious matter. According to the version of the Russian Federation and its propaganda, and possibly the leaders in the Kremlin, this really could be true. And it could be, that Epstein was a Russian agent and was gathering some data for Russian intelligence, or for organized crime to blackmail influential people in the Western world. This really could be true. But it clearly does not include Zelensky, Kuchma, Yanukovych, the Timoshenkos, and now Budanov. And that's it. Budanov is not mentioned there. Valery Kripstein, well, at least that's not written about. That's it. But who is mentioned? A lot of representatives from both the Democratic and Republican parties are actually mentioned, as well as people from Trump's circle. That's it. And could this become a reason for manipulation or for pulling the necessary strings for Putin's team right now in terms of adjustments? Ukraine's position, influence on Trump so that he would adjust his stance. Could this be the case? Well, look at the Daily Mail. Here, I'm showing it now, breaking down, analyzing the story. Could Epstein's sex empire have been something like that? You know, like cheese in a mousetrap created by the KGB, for example. Could Epstein really have worked for the KGB, the FSB? And, it seems like he could have, right? He could have. American intelligence agencies, according to reports, as well as security services, believe that Epstein had long-standing ties to Russian organized crime, which could have blackmailed him and forced him to do this. This could explain how easily Epstein apparently was able to bring in girls from Russia by plane, such is the assumption, and then all the influential people who were with these girls. Those girls could have been gathering information about these people, including those close to Trump, or maybe even about Trump himself. Other names are mentioned in the modern: Prince Andrew, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and so on. By the way, similarly, the Clintons, Bill and Hillary, have agreed to testify in court. This became known today. They will go and testify in court in order to, well, eliminate any questions about possible influence. As for Bill Clinton, you know about his reputation, but Hillary's is absolutely spotless. So could this be a sign that all of this is being done intentionally? There are 300 materials about Ukraine, about Derkach, about the city of Sumy, Zelensky, Poroshenko, and Kuchma. Could this be an element of influence on Trump's fate so that he would ultimately decide how to behave and whether to turn a blind eye to the shelling of Ukrainian infrastructure? Well, that's one possible scenario, and really there's no need to be surprised by it. The Russian Federation will do everything to delegitimize representatives of the Ukrainian government, the state, those elected through legitimate means, and will keep tying current events to this until the very end, even events that happened 12 years ago.